Right, that's great. Welcome, everybody. It's really nice to see such a varied group around that's participating in this conference. My name is, just for quick introductions, my name is Sylvia, and I'm one of the clinical coordinators here at Foundry Vancouver. This is
Hey, Lynn, we can't hear you.
Oh, really?
Now we can.
Oh, okay. Could you hear Sylvia?
Yeah, we could.
Let's project better. Well, should I introduce myself again then? Yes. Okay, I'm Lynn, and I'm a clinical coordinator at Foundry Vancouver. Did you hear that?
Yep, you bet. And my name is Erin Backer, and I'm the manager of Renfrew House Youth Program, which we'll be talking about later on in the session.
Normally, I would really like to have everybody introduce themselves as well, but for the purposes of time, I think that we would love to see if people could introduce themselves in the chat, just so that we can get a sense of sort of who you are and where you're from, and perhaps what organization you are presenting. So I just want to put that out there. We are going to be starting our presentation on supportive housing for youth with high-risk substance use. But before we start that, I just wanted to acknowledge that we are on the unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I want to give thanks for this privilege to be able to live, play, and present on this territory. Okay, so we are going to be talking a bit about our specific work and our collaboration between Foundry and Coast Mental Health on supportive housing, and in particular the Renfrew House, which is the house that we work together on. Erin, if you could go to the next slide, please. So just a little bit of an outline of how we are going to be spending the next 45 minutes together. Lynn and I will spend about 10 minutes just giving a little bit of an outline about Foundry and our integrated youth services model. And then Erin will be presenting and giving some information and history around Coast Mental Health Services, and more specifically about Renfrew House. And then we thought that it would be useful to go over a case study just to outline sort of the journey of a youth through Renfrew House. And then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for discussions and questions afterwards. So feel free to, if you have questions, we're hoping we'll have time at the end. But if you wanted to, we'll certainly try to monitor what's on the chat. But also, if you want to, feel free to just interrupt, and we're pretty casual. We'll do our best to answer those questions.
Yeah, you can just throw yourselves in there, and feel like we're also, if you want to turn your camera on, that's cool, or you can keep it off, whatever you all want. Yeah, we're happy.
Okay. Next slide, Erin. So just to give a little bit of quick history around Foundry. Foundry really was started in 2007 by a couple of psychiatrists at St. Paul's Hospital. It wasn't known as Foundry at the time. It was really just a concept idea, and it was really based on the fact that this group of psychiatrists identified a real need around youth and young adults that were coming through our emergency departments and repeatedly and not getting the care that they need. I'm sure that this is a concern that unfortunately still is a problem for us, but essentially that was where this came from. So very much a grassroots approach to the work. In the middle of this photo, you'll see Dr. Steve Mathias, and he's now our executive director for Foundry. He and this group of psychiatrists identified a gap in the services, and really then committed to trying to address this gap. So that was in 2007. In 2015, the first Foundry center was open. At the time, it was called Inner City Youth. And it was really the model and the intent was to provide an integrated approach to youth youth services, mental health and substance use services. Next slide. So what does integrated approach mean? So integrated approach for each Foundry Center, I should backtrack. While Foundry Vancouver was the original Foundry Center, it is at this point now a provincial organization. There are a number of Foundry Centers across the province with more to come. You may have heard or may have read in sort of, I think last week's Minister of Health report is that we were really happy to hear that we have now received additional funding to develop 12 more centers across the province. So that should probably bring us close to 20, if not over 20 centers across the province. We don't know where those centers will be just yet. There was a sort of process that is involved with that, but it does mean that this model is something that's valued, and I think will play an ongoing and continued and important role around trying to reach youth as early as possible and as close to the community as possible. So this slide really talks a bit about it illustrates just what an integrated model looks like, that each center will provide the service, which is physical health, mental health, substance use services, social services, and peer support services. How each of those particular buckets of services are delivered may vary from center to center, depending on the partnerships. But those are the major goals of each center of services to be provided. So next slide, please.
Yeah, so here at our center, because of where we're located, and I think because of the original intention of inner city youth when it began in 2007, we tend to see a lot of youth that are situated in the downtown east side or the city. And so a lot of the youth we wind up serving are homeless or have a history of homelessness or are precariously housed. And of course, in the city, the housing crisis is not news to anybody, I'm sure, attending this conference. So just for some context, in Vancouver in 2020, the city did a study and found that 9% of our entire homeless population are youth under 25. So it's about 200 youth as of 20. You know, we experience the youth that we serve here at the center. There are many pathways, of course, that result in homelessness. One common one is youth who have aged out of foster care with MCFD, youth that experience co-occurring other challenges and psychological determinants, so mental illness, other neurocognitive challenges, co-occurring substance use, and then some of those larger determinants where multiple systems interact, poverty, racism, lack of access to supports, and other social determinants that lead to homelessness, not to mention just the expense of living in Vancouver. You know, people wind up homeless. So, you know, there are a lot of risks that go along with being a student-involved youth, of course, violence, emotional disturbances, substance use, increased risk in the streets, behavioral issues, and of course, like interrupted or disrupted trajectory in terms of their development. A lot of the youth that we see have missed out on pretty vast portions of their lives as a result of some of the challenges that they faced. So that's our population. So this is just a little infograph that the beautiful red circle there sort of highlights. The main point is that at a point of, what does PIT stand for?
A point in time.
Point in time. Yeah. Point in time study done by the federal government in 2018. They found that half of all respondents to this point in time study experienced homelessness when they were still under the age of 25. So that's huge. So essentially individuals who experience homelessness under 25, there's a 50% chance that they'll continue to experience homelessness throughout their lives. And so I think the point here is that, you know, if you look at this from a healthcare perspective, if this was any other challenge, we would be throwing so many resources at it. Not to say that we don't throw a lot of resources at homelessness and housing, but that's a huge rate in terms of trajectory. And so it just can't be understated how dire and how important it is to house young people that are facing these. That's it for slide.
Excellent.
Oh, this is just saying more of the same, but it's just such a beautiful circle. So much orange in it. We wanted to show it again. For real. Sylvia, back over to you.
Oh, well, I mean, this was just sort of further other sort of risk factors. Again, just evidence around homelessness and that, youth with mental health and addiction, that, the evidence shows that their lifespan is actually 3 decades shorter than someone in the average population. So again, speaks to the significant sort of health impact of homelessness. Next slide.
So we offer a host of services at our clinic, and some of these are unique to our center, and many of them are replicated throughout the province and other Foundry centers. So I'll just read off this slide. We offer mental health and substance use services, psychosocial rehabilitation groups and programming, primary care. We have a number of supports for youth seeking housing. We have peer support, daily walk-in counseling, and then we offer a number of groups, including DBT. We have resources for families and caregivers as well, including offering EFFT training for people caring for youth who are experiencing challenges related to mental health and substance use. And then we focus really heavily as well on the points of transition. So youth aging out of like the child system into sort of the young adult system, and then youth aging out of the youth and young adult system into adult services. We know, of course, that those points of transition are huge in terms of being able to continue services, and there are many opportunities for youth to get lost in the system at those transition points. So we take a lot of care in trying to provide as much care as we can during the transition. I think the other thing that's not mentioned really on this slide is that we do have a very robust psychiatry department and intensive case management services as well. That's it for this slide. Yeah. Do you want to throw something in?
No, I was just going to say, because I know we're going to transition over to Erin now, but I just want to give people an opportunity. Are there any questions about Foundry before we move on? Okay. All right. Over to you, Erin.
Okay, so a little bit about Coast Mental Health. Coast Mental Health, we recently celebrated our 50 years of providing services in the community for individuals with mental illness. Some of the different services that are provided through Coast is we have a large support services department that houses that runs the clubhouse, the resource center, both of which offer a wide range of services, including peer support, a trust program, street outreach, and an art room. The clubhouse was the first part of Coast that was opened 50 years ago, back in, I think it was 1972. So it's been around for a while now. At the clubhouse and the resource center, you will also find the employment and education programs and services. And so within that, there's the young adults program, which offers different culinary training and other employment opportunities, including a monthly employment workshop that takes place over 3 days, and young adults can go to that and learn about different employment opportunities, and then sometimes get connected with them through that. And then there's also the 2 social enterprises, which is the Social Crust Cafe and catering, and then the Landscaping with Heart that offers supportive employment for folks with mental illness. And then one of the large pieces of Coast is the housing section, or the housing division. And within that, we have a wide range of different housing services that cover the full spectrum of the housing continuum. So that goes all the way from forensic cottages and rehab and recovery programs, located on Smequaela, which is formerly known as Riverview. And from there, we have supportive housing, independent living, enhanced housing, all the way over to our fully licensed community homes that provide 24/7 staffing. And so there's 17 homes across Vancouver Coastal Health and Fraser Health Authority region. And that will bring us to talking a little bit about Renfrew House Youth Program. So Renfrew House Youth Program falls into the community homes section, and it is a licensed care facility under the, I have to read it every time, the Community Care and Assisted Living Act in British Columbia. And so we're regulated through those folks and through Vancouver Coastal Health, and we provide 24-hour awake staff on site at all of the different homes. And so Renfrew House itself is a particularly unique home, and that is a bit what we're going to talk about today. So Renfrew is a safe, supportive, and substance-free home-like environment for youth ages 19 to 24. And it acts as a short-term transitional housing program and has supportive staff on site 24/7. So Renfrew House itself, we have 8 beds here. And another piece that makes us a little bit unique is that the program we offer is an abstinence-based program. So the youth who are coming to live here are at a point in their life where they're recognizing perhaps that they have some problem substance use, or that they want to try out living substance-free for a period of time, or perhaps for the rest of their lives. The house itself is located in East Vancouver, and it's in a residential neighborhood that's outside of the downtown core. I think that was a conscious decision of sort of spreading out into the city and moving a little bit away from the downtown core, just to give the youth, many of them have come from living in the downtown core, and so just giving them a little bit of space from the hustle and bustle of downtown. So in terms of operations and administration, the program itself is funded by Providence Healthcare. The staff on site who are here 24/7 are employees of Coast Mental Health, and we work really closely in collaboration with Foundry Vancouver and the teams that work over there. And then the home itself is owned by BC Housing. Okay, so the youth that you will find at Renfrew House. So we have a wide variety of youth who come and live here, some for short periods of time, anywhere up to a year or even a little bit more than a year. All of our referrals are 19 to 24 years old, and so young folks with complex mental illness, substance use disorders, many of which have experienced homelessness or inadequate or unsafe housing throughout their lives. Many of our youth have developmental or cognitive disabilities, and many of them have experienced chronic suicidality, self-harm, frequent hospitalizations, and many of them have had multiple overdoses in their life. Okay, so in terms of the parts that Coast Mental Health youth workers are providing on-site 24/7, so our staff are available for the youth to support with emotional and crisis management. We do run a full medication program, so all of the medications are kept locked up in our office and are administered by staff on site. And then when it comes to any OAT medications, so Suboxone, methadone, and Cadian, we have another pharmacy that comes and delivers those daily, and they get administered, witnessed by the pharmacist on site. So the Coast staff prepare meals daily. There's dinner that happens every night. And then throughout the day, the youth have access to the kitchen area. There's a fridge and cupboards filled with food, so they can make meals either on their own, or they can get support from either staff or their co-residents. We have a van here that we're very lucky to have had donated to us, and that allows our staff to provide transportation back and forth from appointments, from important opportunities in the community, different programs, so that youth who may need that extra support getting to and from important activities in the community are able to continue doing that. We also offer, with the same van, daily outings. We do a whole bunch of activities. We keep the youth super engaged and having a good time as much as possible. And then, of course, just the day-to-day life skill building and healthy habits building. Our staff are around, and you know, anything from reminding youth to brush their teeth twice a day to making it to appointments on time or calling ahead if they're going to be late to something. So a lot of just that extra support on a daily basis. And then I'll pass it back over to Lynn and Sylvia just to talk a little bit about some of the clinical services that Foundry provides on site here at Renfrew.
Thanks, Erin. I'll try to lean in a bit so that I'm a bit more audible. We have a gym, an actual like workout gym below our clinic, and they're really loud right now. So any grunting or yelling that's happening that you're hearing, it's not us.
We're noted.
Yeah. So
we're staff.
It's a mixed martial arts gym below us. So
yeah.
Yeah.
So just enjoy that.
Yeah. Apologies.
Yeah. So yeah, so Foundry, we also provide clinical services on site at Renfrew House. And so that looks like this. Okay, we only case manage youth, so we have an intensive case management team here, and so youth that are served by our case management team are eligible to go to Renfrew House, and so along with that, we were able to provide a continuity of services for youth. So case managed youth also have a dedicated psychiatrist. So when youth go to Renfrew House, they retain their same case manager, they retain their psychiatrist, and so they get to continue on with that care. And case managers are on site at Renfrew House at least weekly in order to meet with youth that they're serving that have transitioned at Renfrew House. And psychiatrists also do outreach to Renfrew House quite frequently. As part of those services, we also offer prescription, medication management and monitoring. So we can continue with whatever whatever medication and psychiatric services that youth are being offered while they're there. That's a great part. Previously at Renfrew House, I think when it first opened, the clinical staff on site, there was 2 nurses for many years, and then about 4 years ago, we decided to change that up, and so. And so instead of having 2 nurses, now we have a full-time occupational therapist. Sorry, she's not there full-time, but we have an occupational therapist and 2 rehabilitation assistants that are on site at Foundry. And I think that is sort of the crux of what makes Renfrew House a little bit different in terms of the way that clinical services are provided there. So as part of the psychosocial rehab programming that happens at Renfrew House, we have rehab staff on site there 4 days a week. And through that, they're offering one-to-one support group programming, life skill development and assessments. And what's really cool about that is, I don't know how many of you are familiar with occupational therapy or PSR work, but the goal is to be able to support people as much as possible in like their home or natural environment so that we can sort of see how they're managing their day-to-day life. And Renfrew House really allows us to do that. So part of this work is that the occupational therapist can go in and provide an initial assessment when the youth first enters the program, and then can continue to assess as they grow and change as they integrate within the program. So we can look at things like, cognitive function, communication, integration, life skills, all through like a contextual lens where instead of just sort of projecting how youth might be doing when they come to see us in hospital or when they come to see us in clinic, we're there hanging out with them, like seeing them interact with their peers, seeing them interact with other staff, seeing them go to their jobs or seeing them go to other programs. And so we really have an opportunity as a whole program to observe, to assess, and then to really provide like tailored interventions and plans alongside youth. So of course, we're able to look at every youth that's there in a really holistic way, and youth are involved really in every part of their own care programming. So we look at like we provide care with youth's own goals in mind. So it's very goal focused. The care plans are individualized, and we work closely with youth, with their families if they have caregivers and other people they identify in terms of their own networks, and with co-staff and the psychiatric team at Foundry. I think part of that as well is, because of the way that housing is and the way that services are following Renfrew House, we take a lot of care to make sure that we're transition planning essentially from the moment a youth arrives on site at Renfrew House, because we want to be able to discharge them when they're finished at Renfrew House to the most appropriate resource possible. And so we really start that process early in their time at Renfrew House. So a youth can stay at Renfrew House, for on some occasions we've had youth stay for over a year, and not necessarily because they're still gaining a lot from the program, but often because there's nowhere suitable to discharge to. So we are able to have the freedom to keep youth housed there as long as they need to be housed there. And so while they're there, they're engaged in group programming, focusing on life skills and skill building, self-awareness. And we do like a lot of goal-based work. And our goal is always we're thinking in mind, because we only serve youth up to 25. So we always have in mind this idea that how can we best prepare youth for when they ultimately will transition from our services at age 25? What do they need to be able to thrive and survive and have as little interaction as possible with formal services? And Renfrew House just does a great job of providing those wraparound services, of being really holistic in their care, and providing this space where youth have so much say in their own health trajectories while they're there. And then, of course, typically when you leave Renfrew House, they're still involved in Foundry services, so we're able to follow along with them through the transition back to community or to wherever it is. Oh, and the other thing, I know I'm still talking on this slide, but there's a lot to say. The other thing about this is just talking about substance use, because the whole point of this, or one of the points of this house, is that it is an abstinence-based program, and that youth are learning how to live without using substances. So Renfrew House, I think, is pretty unique in that we don't actually focus a lot on substance use or substance abstinence. Instead, we look at a youth's entire life. And so we're focusing on helping them build like self-efficacy, confidence, communication skills, like identifying other things in their lives that are meaningful and important to them, so that they don't feel like they need to be using substances quite so much. And of course, while youth are at the house, they're able to attend, community-based substance use programming, detox programs, and other substance use focused programs provided, but it's not mandatory. We do encourage it as needed. These are based on what youth actually wants, and so we recognize that part of recovery from substance use, of course, is relapse, and so we treat substance use relapses individually when they happen. It's not just like a 3 strikes you're out sort of scenario, and because each youth comes into the program with individual strengths and with individual needs, we really react and treat any relapses that happen in the house individually, and make decisions based on what is best, not only for the youth, but also for the larger community of youth that are living there. And so we are able to be flexible in that, and to work through those situations when they arrive. I think that's it for this very long slide. Do you want to?
Any questions before we move to the case study?
Yeah, that was a lot. I really went for it. Oh, we got a question. Can I read it? I'm going to read it. The programs sound really cool and comprehensive. Why, thank you. What, if any, would the three of you say are the greatest areas of breakdown or frustration you experience? I can pipe up with one right off the bat, which I already touched on, I think, is just the lack of services available following Renfrew. Like, we can really do it up when you're there. And then sometimes they're just waiting and waiting and waiting for mental health housing or for another appropriate housing service. When their time at Renfrew is sort of naturally coming to an end, and those resources are the wait lists are long. So I think, to me, that's one of my greatest frustrations, is not being able to move youth along when they're ready, or even if they're discharged early for various reasons. Like, it's just really tough to get people into the right service. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say housing is definitely a big one. I think along with the sort of lack of timely substance use services, which I'm hoping is slowly going to change over the next few years, I think that's a big part of it. And I think the other part that we also continue to struggle, not only at Renfrew House, but for a lot of our youth in intensive case management, well, for some of our youth in intensive case management, are youth that have developmental disabilities, and trying to either reconnect them or get them out, have them assessed for eligibility for CL Community Living BC services. So that's another piece where I think that there's a huge frustration. I think where we see youth that sometimes it's like they should have been eligible for services, but for whatever reason, and prior to 18, they were either lost to care, and that eligibility was never completed. And there's a huge amount of work that's involved then around trying to then determine their eligibility. And it is only further complicated because they are, using substances. And then the other part of it would be youth that are lost to care, but we're already eligible. So that's another part that's a huge source of frustration for us to try to get them reconnected. And so my question always is, why were they lost to care to begin with? You have any thoughts as well?
I would definitely agree with both of you in those two pieces being the main frustrations, I would say. Absolutely.
Okay, maybe we'll move to the next slide, which is the case study. So for this case study, this is we really sort of put together a couple of youth that we worked with. So there's no, if it seems like someone you might be familiar with, it isn't. It's really like pulling a bunch of different experiences together that we thought would highlight sort of an example of a youth that would both be a Foundry youth, but potentially also a Renfrew House youth. So for this particular situation, we want to talk about this 22-year-old young man that came through Foundry. This was, I'm going to just speak about sort of prior to them entering Renfrew, and then once they entered Renfrew, Lynn and Aaron will speak to the story and the journey of this particular youth once they so this 22-year-old young man came to us through a referral from the hospital, and he had been admitted to the inpatient mental health unit. He had been picked up in a very dire strait. He was homeless, living on the street, and was really described as being almost nonverbal. Once he ended up in hospital, he had a fairly lengthy admission to hospital. And what was found at that point was that this young man was actually, had a history, had been through the foster care system, had aged out, and interesting enough, had actually been determined to be eligible for CLBC services for Community Living BC. And at one point had been receiving one-to-one support from them, as well as was living in a home share. Somewhere between 19 and 22, though, he became lost to care. And And that's always a question for us about sort of what happened. He had stopped returning to his home share. He had stopped engaging with his one-to-one worker. So, Community Living BC, this, has some excellent services, but they are very clear that they are voluntary services. So if an adult says, I don't want to see you anymore, I don't want your services anymore, they essentially their hands are tied in terms of, what kind of support they can provide. And so as far as we can tell from sort of the last 2 years prior to him ending up in hospital, he had very little to do with Community Living BC. So, and during that time, I think part of the disengagement was that he unfortunately had started using illicit substances and then had migrated to the downtown east side. And I think the vulnerability was something, because of his developmental disability, was something that I think unfortunately, made him very vulnerable and was preyed upon by some people that are also in the downtown east side. He was somebody who was part of a band who had periodic lump sum payments of $5,000 to $8,000, $9,000 at a time. And he'd been receiving those lump sums for the last few years. But at the time when he came to our care, he had no idea what happened to all those monies. There was no money in his bank account. And the best he could explain was someone had said that they would help him, but obviously they didn't. So pretty significant concerns, adult guardianship concerns, as well as concerns under his mental health welfare. As part of his transition planning, he was starting to come to our clinic from the hospital just for a few visits. And I remember our psychiatrist at that time remarking that he was so profoundly withdrawn and had difficulty even stringing a full sentence together. So, now, and during that admission, we were fortunate that we had a bed available, and it was something that was offered to him, and he expressed an interest in going and to try to spend some time there in an absence-based environment. And so he was transferred. He was discharged after a long admission directly to Renfrew House. So I think we'll go to the next slide, and I'll hand that over to Lynn and Aaron.
I think it's you, Aaron.
For sure, yeah. Yeah, so thank you, Sylvia, for introducing that piece. So I can talk, I wasn't here right at the beginning to see some of this young person's gains, but I can say based on what other people have told me that this young person came to Renfrew House and kind of as Sylvia had just described, was very quiet, quite withdrawn, often downcast, and would respond to staff questions either by shaking his head or nodding for yes. And over not super long period of time, things sort of evolved, and staff started getting one-word answers from him. And so we had yes and no and okay, and slowly that sort of continued to evolve up until the point where I started working at Renfrew House. And by the time I was there, this young person was incredibly engaged in all of the programs and activities that were offered both on site here at Renfrew House and in the community by Renfrew, and in the community and through Foundry Services. And so at this point, the young person was someone who was doing their chores. The youth here have an assigned chore daily. So he was doing his chore every day without any prompts from staff, keeping his room and his living space clean, taking his medications consistently with support from staff, and even was attending volunteering twice a week. I believe he was doing 2 4-hour shifts a week at 2 different organizations in the community. And it was definitely a real sense of pride for him. He liked to talk about really his involvement in giving back to the community and being a part of some of those volunteer experiences. you know, like throughout his time here, what we see with many of the youth that live here is there are ongoing challenges with substance use that like relapse is a part of recovery. And so kind of what Lynn was mentioning before, how we really look at treating each relapse individually based on the young person that is involved in that, what happened, and where they're at in terms of their goals and hopes and next steps for the future. So for this individual in particular, there were multiple relapses, and oftentimes that would lead to being away from Renfrew House for several days at a time, and leading to a return where he would come home having used many substances. Staff would assess him, make sure that he was stable, and then sort of set up a bed in the common room on one of the couches just so he can get some rest with close supervision from staff, making sure that he's stable. Usually after about 48 hours, he'd come around and be back and ready to engage in programming. And we would wait until that point just to make sure that he was back to his usual self, just to sit down with myself, usually the case manager, and sit down with him and just talk a little bit about what happened leading up to the relapse, what happened during the relapse, what he may be feeling or thinking about now that it's happened, and really looking at what his goals are. Do you want to continue living at Renfrew House? And if the answer is yes, then let's get creative and come up with a plan on how we can support you with that. And that looks very different for each youth, depending on their unique strengths, skills, needs, goals. And I think I'll pass that over to you, Lynn, and you can expand a little bit on that piece as well.
Yeah, I don't know if there's much to say. Like, I think in particular with this youth, you know, because of his co-occurring cognitive challenges as well. So some of the decision making around using substances just looks a lot different than it would possibly for other youth. And so we really took that in mind as well as some of the resources or lack of resources that he sort of came with, because he's somebody that if we discharged him, you know, immediately following a relapse, he would have been discharged to homelessness. And because he had so many other co-occurring challenges, that would have posed a huge safety risk for him. It may have been, you know, like a bit of a death warrant almost, if we had just said, okay, like 3 strikes, you're out. So we didn't do that with that youth. And even when, at the time when it came to discharge, we really waited until we had another appropriate resource for him to attend, and kept him at the house so that he was long enough so that he was safe in that transition. And then of course we continue to work with him. He's still management team. We did discharge him to another mental health housing resource, another abstinence-based mental health housing resource, and he continues to thrive and do well. I don't think there's much add to his story. Yeah, we really look individually at the needs when it comes to. Of course, we can't have you staying and just like flagrantly using all the time in the house. That's not on the table, because we have to honor the fact that other residents are trying to remain substance free, and so you've got someone around who's using a lot, and that jeopardizes them as well. So it's always a balance, but I think we do a pretty good job of finding that balance and making decisions that are safe for individuals and also for the group. Sometimes it can be tricky, but the partnership is, I think, really strong between us and Coast, and it really supports the work that we do.
Yeah, and I think also, through this journey at Renfrew, there was an opportunity to reestablish that relationship and the services through Community Living BC, and really some education, you know, and working with the outreach workers with Community Living BC. So, and you know, one of the things I would add about Community Living BC is that, you know, in our years of now working with them, they really have come around working directly with us, you know, and really working as part of the team when a youth comes under our care. So, and that has been hugely beneficial And again, I can't think of any other way that we'd be able to do this work unless they were part of the partnership.
Next slide.
I think that brings us to questions.